Hello and welcome to another episode of the Indie Alternative Podcast. It's me, Chris. On this episode, we're going back to Britpop as I'm joined by writer Jane Savidge. Jane Savidge is not only a writer, but she was the co-founder and head of public relations for the company Savage and Best. And Jane is wildly credited as being one of the main instigators of the Britpop musical movement and represented so many of the bands that you would associate with that era. Jane talks a bit about her first book, Lunch with the Wild Frontiers, which came out in 2019, but also talks a lot about her upcoming book, Here They Come With Their Makeup On, which explores Suede's comeback album coming up and all the circumstances surrounding that album. It's a really fascinating read, and I've put links to both those books in the show notes. Just before we hit the interview, here's a quick reminder of all the ways you can support the podcast. You can follow me on social media, and all those links are in the show notes. If you'd like to buy me a virtual coffee, you can do that as well, and links to that coffee donation site is in the show notes. And thirdly, reviewing, rating and following the podcast is the best way for me to get to new listeners. So if you haven't done any of that, if you could take 5 minutes out of your day to do that, would be fantastic. Thank you. So this is basically an unedited conversation with Jane because there was so much good stuff. I better stop waffling and play it. So here's the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Jane Savidge. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, whereabouts are you?
I'm in Crouch End in North London. I don't know if you know that area, but I mean, it's. I'm trying to describe it really. I mean, I always say it's close to Hampstead and Highgate, but that's just me boasting. It's near somewhere with very green space. It's a bit further away than that, but it's nice. It's like a village in London, really. Yeah.
So you've been busy writing throughout the sort of pandemic time, but have you found it been quite? Obviously, it's been restricted for anybody, but for a writer, it must have been business as usual. I'm guessing.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I've obviously got a second book coming out in April, and so I'm trying to think when I started writing this second book, probably right at the end of 2020, so halfway through the pandemic. But I've kind of been planning it for ages. It's kind of a follow-up to the first one. I'm trying to write a definitive 90s trilogy. That's my kind of, sort of that era. And so the first, Lunch with the Wild Frontiers, was kind of my attempt to pretend that I invented Britpop accidentally by representing bands that were around at the time. And this one is kind of like a microscopic sort of analysis of one record in particular, Suede's Coming Up album, which I think is the greatest comeback record ever because, well, for lots of reasons, but one of them being that Oasis, Blur and Pulp sprang up, whilst they were dismembering themselves, basically. So I thought I wanted to talk about that, but it's also got lots of other stories which are kind of around that era. So, parties in Paris and then my encounters with George Michael. So it's kind of like it's a follow-up to that first one, which was mainly lots of stories around Britpop, and then there'll be a third one with no lockdown at all, which I've started, which is kind of going to be. I mean, it'll probably end with me being invited to the House of Commons to meet Peter Mandelson when he wanted to talk about all the Britpop stars being perfect for their support of Tony Blair, basically. So that's kind of where that went from.
I mean, this is obviously right up my street in terms of the seasons 1 to 3 of Back to Britpop, the podcast where I delved into my own sort of record collection over the first lockdown and rediscovered a lot of artists and, Enemy and Melody Maker, cover cassettes and things like that. And it's been a fascinating journey. But I mean, you've worked with so many influential and, I say big names in terms of that indie alternative Britpop era. But I mean, in terms of before we get there, what kind of your first forays into that was like looking into not managing bands, but just promoting bands as well?
Well, I mean, I'm still a publicist these days, but I describe my passport says writer and publicist rather than just publicist. So obviously, I mean, I was at university doing a degree in philosophy. I mean, if you want to know about my journey, as it were, and I was in a band, and I came to London with the manager of the band to surprise his girlfriend, who had a PR company called 10 Times Better, and we crawled through the window to surprise her. She was annoyed because she wasn't expecting to see anybody. Initially, she thought I was Dave Gahan of Depeche Mode, so I think I had short hair, even though I didn't look anything like him. And when she was annoyed with me, she said, oh, could you just type this press release up? And it was something handwritten. So I went to the typewriter, looked at it. It was terrible writing. Put my own interpretation of it, gave it to her. She read it and said, "Wow, how on earth did you do that?" I said, "What did it was? It was to make it much better." So she had a dream that night that she was going to work with me. And so she rang me and said, "Would I work with her?" And I said, "Only if you sack everybody that you're working with." So she went, "Okay." And she set up a PR business with me called Mel Bell Publicity. And we did Gay Bikers on Acid and the Rhythm Sisters and Daniel Dax. A record label called Homestead Records with some amazing stuff on it, like Big Dipper and Soul Asylum and people like that. Then we did Green on Red and all that New American Invasion. Then I got a job at Virgin Records, just because I think Virgin must have run the NME, and I was recommended as a good, publicist. And I started doing Roy Orbison's press, which is obviously incredibly way out of my league. But I just, he was amazing, and hung out with him for about the 6 to 8 weeks at the end of his life, and then he died whilst I was looking after him, which was horribly tragic because he was such a wonderful artist. And then this was at the end of this is 1990 basically, and then I left Virgin to write poetry because I didn't want to, I didn't like being handed bands that had been just handed down to me, sort of, do press for this. If I was ever going to do it again, I'd only do bands that I loved because I couldn't see the point in just lying about artists. So I quit.
Yeah.
And John Best, who'd quit Virgin just prior to that, and he rang me and said, "You said you'd never do press again. I've just been handed the contract for the Pixies and the Cocteau Twins. What do you think about that?" So I said, "Okay." So obviously, if I was ever going to start work again, it was for those two bands. In fact, the whole of 4AD. And at that time, 1990, me and John had a company, and I found this band called Curve, who had a great, and I got them for loads of press. And then one week, we had the cover of every single music magazine with a different band: The Farm, the Pixies, the Cocteau Twins, Dead Can Dance, and Curve. All on the cover of every single music paper. So I was either getting quite good or just being very good at being at the right place at the right time. And I also, sorry if I'm rambling on, by the way, but
no, carry on. It's great.
So I also made, I was doing a few movements around that time as well, like shoegazing. And I noticed that if you had a band and you weren't really getting anywhere, if you just put them together with other bands, journalists used to think, well, there's something going on here, isn't there? And I noticed that with Green on Red, who got more press if they were putting an article with the New American Revolution. And when I was doing Gay Bikers on Acid, I noticed that if I put them in with Pop Elite itself and other bands, they'd be part of the new Grebo revolution.
Yeah.
And same with shoegazing, because we were doing Moose and Lush and all those bands at the same time. And kind of out of all that, there came this thing called the Camden Scene, which was all the bands that used to come to our office to be interviewed in the pub down the road, which was the Good Mixer. And the Camden Scene became the Britpop scene. But the Britpop scene, this is where I say I accidentally invented Britpop, is because apart from the fact we sent all the bands down this horrible pub down the road, which has now been spruced up, by the way, to do all their interviews, with the sticky feet and etc. I also, when I was at Virgin, I remember doing a band and the managing director said, "They're flying in next week. Can you fill a day of interviews for them?" And I thought, I was 23 or something. I thought, oh God, the pressure. Can I actually? I mean, I'm sure people have that all the time now. When you have to organise a press conference, you think, will anybody come? But to fill a whole day for an unknown band who are flying in, the pressure was. I remembered that pressure, and I thought, when I left, I don't want to do American bands ever again. Not because I was anti-American, but because of that. Maybe I was lazy or something. So when we were offered the Smashing Pumpkins, I said no. At that time, even though, I love their songs, but I would never have ever considered doing them because I knew the manager would ring up and say, "Fill their day, please." So because of that, we never did American bands. We ended up with this really sort of like media-friendly roster who lived around the corner, and they'd ring up and say, "Can we interview one of your bands?" "Yeah, just be here in 5 minutes." They're not on a plane in 2 weeks. They're actually round the corner. And I think because of that, it became this marriage of convenience. All those bands got lots of press. It was just convenient for everybody, and they're all British.
I mean, describe in your words kind of what you felt was happening at the time, because obviously I remember it being a teenager, and it could probably something a little bit different to you. Exciting and just diverse and everything else. But did you have the feeling that there was something like a movement or something happening?
It's really difficult to know what you're living through at the time, because I was young. I wasn't a teenager, but I was, in my 20s. So, in my late 20s. So I think all of us were, we had a small office, became bigger and bigger until we had 10 people. No one really had a steady boyfriend or girlfriend. No one went home at night. We stayed in the office drinking and watching our bands on TFI Friday, it was called. And if you weren't at Top of the Pops, I mean, I had 5 bands on one week, on the show. It's like the Cranberries, Pulp and Suede and Elastica. So we often went to Top of the Pops on a Wednesday and then TFI Friday on a Friday. But we often didn't want to go home. If we weren't going to a gig, or we went to a gig in Camden, we came back to the office to party. And there aren't many people that do that these days, I don't think. Because
the House of Commons.
House of Commons, because it's not so much fun, I guess. I mean, maybe it is, but it might have been, so it was partly to do with that. It was great music, obviously. I mean, it was ludicrous as well, because the Verve, or Verve as they were called then, before they had to change their name because it clashed with the jazz label of the same name. We were managing them at the time, and Richard used to come into the office, often without shoes on, but and just hang around, and everyone. So there were bands in our offices because they were the same age as us. They'd rather go to hang around with us because we didn't have a financial sort of hand in their, their affairs really. We weren't their record. We were the same age. We liked all the same things. And the Verve got called, a Camden band, part of the Camden Scene, even though they're from Wigan. So that was, it's ludicrous.
How did you approach bands? I mean, were they looking for you, or was it the other way around? Did you have a kind of like an antenna that instinctively knew where the quality was?
I think, we were a cool company. I mean, Savidge and Best is it's handy that my name was Savidge and John's name was Best. That's quite a cool. That sounds like a made-up name, even if it's our two surnames.
Yeah.
We didn't even think about that. And did we look for bands? Well, we were out every night, but it all changed when we saw Suede. And Suede, we started doing them from very early on. And when they were on the cover of Melody Maker, before the first single came out, which was really a last-minute decision by Steve Sutherland to put them on rather than EMF, I think. It was like a composite thing.
Yeah.
A week before their record came out, and that was kind of like, that just changed everything, not just for Suede, for us as well, because the next day we got inundated with people. People wanted to know about the phenomenon of the band getting on the cover of a magazine before they released a record, as much as they wanted to know about the band themselves. So, obviously a few years later, there was articles about us as a company, which is not great because you're not meant to be the story. Now it's fine because I can all look back and I'm writing books about it. But then I'm sure that maybe Jarvis and Brett were saying, what's going on now?
Were these people aware of their own kind of legacy, do you think, at the time? I mean, we just talk about the bands, as you mentioned, the Verve, Suede, Pulp, and Ultrasound, Echo Belly, 60 Foot Dolls, Cooler Shaker. I mean, all the names. Did you think they had any idea what was going on?
Well, some of them came later, obviously, and knew what was happening on. I thought some of them were more interested in the outcome than what it took to get there, if you know what I mean. I don't want to name names, it's not fair. But I got the feeling that some people were careerists, and realised that if they were associated with Savidge and Best, then that would mean that they became famous and they could make a living out of it. I have no problem with people being really, really on my case, ringing me every day and saying what is going on, because they don't want to have a proper job, if you know what I mean. Or like, if they want to follow their passion, then it's very important for them to be on, if someone can affect their career and make them play the guitar for an extra 10 years, why not, turn up at my house at midnight and say what's going on.
Yeah.
So I can't name names about the people that I thought were trying too hard for the wrong reasons, but certainly the ones that you'd think weren't careerist, they definitely weren't. I mean, Brett might have been really interested in his career, but I thought he was a genius songwriter and deserved. The funny thing about Suede is when I took them on, I fell in love with that band so much by watching them live, and particularly falling in love with a song called Pantomime Horse, that I made them famous as if I was making myself famous. So I kind of wish it's like almost like that thing that thing behind the curtain or whatever. I actually imagined that I was the singer of this band and I could set them on the course to do all these interviews, and I wouldn't get famous myself. So that was amazing because I didn't want to be, but it was almost like I could play with it really.
The way you write is really interesting, and it flows very nicely, and there's so much of you in there that that is almost as interesting as the artist itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, funny enough, in the new book, I've got this sort of this description at the start of the book where I say, what the book is about, because it's ostensibly about bands I've represented, records, etc. And I put little asterisks, and then if you look at the bottom of the page, the asterisk says may contain traces of me, which is kind of like an old trick I used to do when I used to write press releases, and some of them were like 5 pages long, because I thought that was a fun thing to do rather than just the usual drab stuff you read through now. I put an asterisk and go Suede, the best band in the world, and then an asterisk, and then people read the 5 pages, and then get to the asterisk at the end and go they're like true, just like that's what they get to. So they think there must be some sort of a little aside here. Maybe they're not true.
Yeah.
That, and I do write very honestly, and I try and I try and be funny, and people do laugh, a lot when they read my prose, I think.
Yeah, there's so much humor in what I've read so far, and I wanted to ask, in terms of like Lunch with the Wild Frontiers, which was the first book, which came out in 2019, I think, is that right? What was the catalyst for that then? Because obviously you've had these stories and this career. Was there one particular thing that made you think that this was something that you would like to put into writing?
Well, 2 things. One was I kept telling this story to everybody about Roy Orbison, which was about introducing him into Nick Kent, and him loving Nick Kent and wanting Nick Kent to write his biography, and then Roy dying before he could tell him, and I never told Nick. And then this is going to sound so like name dropping, meeting Joe Strummer at Damien Hirst's house down in Devon, and me and Joe getting drunk together, and Joe loving Roy Orbison and loving Nick Kent, saying, "You've got to tell Nick Kent that Roy wanted him to write a book about his life." And I said, "I don't know, I can't do that." He goes, "Well, where's he gone?" "He's gone to Paris with his wife and child. Let's call him." So then Joe, gets the house phone and tries to call, Monsieur Kent, or it just takes for hours and hours until he gives up and falls asleep. And then a few years later, I go to the Brat Awards, where the Enemy are giving an award to Nick Kent and Penny Smith for lifetime achievement. And I think I must tell Nick this story 15 years ago that we'd met, and I never told him that Roy wanted him to write his biography of his life. And I tracked him down when he was holding court with all this, with everybody around drinking. I said, "Nick, I haven't seen you for 15 years. I introduced you to Roy Orbison, and he wanted you to write a story about his life. I never told you. I'm so sorry I never told you. But I'm telling you now." And he went, "Cheers." And that was all he said, right? And so that's why that story is true, because it hasn't got like a gigantic ending. And I told people that story, and they said, "You've got to write that down and make a story out of it." So that was the first story I wrote, and it was kind of there. And then I started writing more, and then I ran every day, and I had a really bad running injury. I couldn't move for 6 months. I could barely walk. So I just stuck with the computer. I thought, I'll write all these things down. So I just wrote all these stories, gave them an arc, and connected them all together. And then I found this really interesting narrative technique, which is because obviously some of my stories, they're all about different bands in different eras. So if you want to write a story about just pulp, you're kind of stuck bringing them into different, chapters. So what I would do is I'd write about pulp, and then I'd move into the future with more of pulp, and then I'd come back and start the next chapter. As long as I started the next chapter chronologically after the last one had started, not necessarily finished, I could have this whole narrative, thing that would work, and then with an arc in between. And that became, and it really worked, I think. I think people, if they're stuck out to write something, they've got all these ideas, and you think they belong in a certain chapter or in a certain area, you can do that. You can move into the future. As long as you come back and you start the next chapter after the last one started, people get it.
Yeah.
And I think, so that's why the first one worked, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I mean, the second, the book that's due in April, which is Here They Come With Their Makeup On, which is I would say it's a love letter to everything about Suede that you love, and also just that whole era for them, the turmoil, and then them coming back with a vengeance with Coming Up. What was the catalyst for that book? Because obviously you've had all this experience and all these artists that you've spoken to, and obviously something about Suede really connected with you, and there's obviously an amazing story to tell here. But was there something that really kicked this off and instigated this as well?
Well, I wasn't done with Suede. I knew that. The first book, there were a couple of chapters about stories with Suede. I had other stories about them that funny stories. They're a very funny band. They kind of might look kind of as if they wear black and everything, but when I used to hang around in the 90s, they made me laugh so much. Their humor was self-deprecating, it was funny, and they had all these jokes about they'd signed so many copies of photos that they would always try and find one that wasn't signed because it was worth more. That was they're in Joel found one here, and because it was all this, and all the stories of being on the road with them. So I thought I wasn't done with them. That was one of the reasons. And also, I think that one of the other catalysts was that I wanted to write a book about an album, and I thought that if I was going to write about an album, it had to be one that I loved and knew, intimately, and could sort of dissect. And when you think of comebacks, everyone goes on about Man United in '99 or Liverpool in 2005, and this comeback, which a lot of people won't remember, was Suede, split up. Half their songwriting partnership had left, and people thought they were finished, completely over, because there was no way they'd write a decent song ever again. So they put an advert in the Melody Maker, and they got a tape in from a 17-year-old schoolboy who was a guitarist. And when the band played, listened to the tape, it was incredible. So the manager rang the boy's parents in Bournemouth. He came to London. He joined the band within a week. He was on top of the pops within a week of joining. That is a baptism of fire. That's quite incredible. But yet they had to tour the old record, which they didn't care about anymore. They did a whole year on tour doing Dogman Star, which must have been, horrible for them, really, before they... So the book starts at the Phoenix Festival when they're just done. They're totally done with this old record, and the heavens are opening, and that's when that kind of the book begins.
And you were right there at the front of it, getting drowned.
I was there. Yes, I was soaking wet. Yeah.
But you went to you were at every gig. I mean, you were you say in the book that you used to stand at the front and used to come backstage and after every gig, and you were as much as a fan as someone they worked for or worked with.
Yes, I know, and that's just quite unusual. I realise that it's possible that a lot of PRs these days don't microscopically or don't go home late at night and dance around in front of the mirror singing all the songs, which is what you do with the band you didn't look after. But I know, I had no intentions of kidnapping the band or anything like that. Two things. One was making bands famous because they deserve to be famous, and the other one was really appreciating the music. And I've always been a massive music fan. My dad was a massive fan of big band music, believe it or not, well before I was born in the 50s. And his record collection, he was kind of like really sort of forthright about what he liked. I think I got my kind of like, arrogance is the wrong word. I used to describe myself as a music taste evangelist, which I think sums it up. If you like something, you tell your friends about it. Mm-hmm. That's probably what my dad was like, actually. Kind of, you really, you dismiss everything else. This is the reason that you should like this record. That's what and then, so that's what I did with Suede. And before Suede, it was REM. I slept in a car for 2 weeks following REM around on tour. I saw 100 gigs of theirs. So I've always been a massive fan of music.
I think the thing about coming up, and I was a Suede fan, pre and post Bernard Butler, but when Richard Oakes came on board, and he was the same age as me, or more or less, or slightly older, there felt like the connection grew, I think, because it felt like it was achievable. I was a young musician, and it was my dream to write and be in these sort of bands and tour and live the lifestyle. And when you see someone of that age achieving that kind of that goal, even by accident in some ways, I guess he was extremely lucky, and obviously very talented.
I think he described it as being like on a roller coaster with your eyes shut. Yeah. But that was probably because actually I don't think his eyesight is very good, and he didn't wear contacts for the first few months. And when he put them actually in, he could see these crazy fans everywhere. But I think that's what it was like for him. I mean, the Bournemouth Echo, when he joined Suede, they rang me up every day saying, "What have you done with our child?" they thought he'd obviously been kidnapped from school by these London types, who were covering him in drugs.
It would have been completely such an eye opener for him to sort of come into that environment where, your book opens with, the Paris gigs and that kind of hedonistic lifestyle, and it's laid bare, but it must have been crazy for him. I mean, to take it all on board, but he did, and he did a fantastic job, and the writing really shone through on Coming Up, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously for that first, it was probably 9 months. He had to mime Bernard's guitar parts in a video and on top of the pops. That can't have been fun. And then he wrote 2 songs together and Bentswood Boys, which became B-sides of singles off Dogman Star. But it's obviously only when it got down to Coming Up that you could see all this tension. And then the template for the record was 10 hits, or Michael Jackson's Thriller, or as Matt said, we want to write 10 Losing My Religions or something, which obviously is a ridiculous thing to say because the benchmark is too high. But there were 5 top 10 singles off that record. No indie band had ever done that. The only band that ever done that is Take That. So, but while all this was happening, on the rails, Oasis had formed. Blur had just released their most successful album, was selling 80,000 copies a week. And Pulp, who people don't even consider, who we looked after as well, so they became the big 3. Suede weren't anywhere. So the fact that the record sold 1.5 million copies, which was 3 times as much as the first 2 records, was not a feasible prospect at the start of it.
Do you remember the first time you heard the album in full, or did you have, because of just connections and what you're working with them, were you listening to it as it was being sort of produced and recorded?
Yeah, I went to the studio a few times. Trash was the one though. That was that was described as the final digit in a phone number, because that was the one that was the missing digit. That was made it everything. Once you had that, that was the promo for the album, really. That was the teaser, as it were, and that was just such an incredible Suede song as well, because obviously it's about, it's about their fans. It's a song for their fans, about their fans. It's about them being, the litter on the breeze. So I think that was probably the moment I knew it was going to work. But even then, on the eve of release, there were all these other rumours, because I think Dodgy had a single out, and obviously Dodgy had got a very dodgy name, and there's a bit more sort of I think everyone was worried that would eclipse Suede's entry into the charts, and thank God it didn't, because that would have been terrible.
Yeah. So in terms of your third book, then, and just if we can get a preview on that, or at least an insight to where you're going with it, what else do you think? You've mentioned it at the start of the conversation, but for you and your career, what specifically aspects are you looking to explore in that one? Because it sounds fascinating.
Okay, well, in the third one, I've already written a long chapter called The Worst Movie I've Never Seen, which is when I looked after Tank Girl, the movie. Yeah. And it was Savidge and Best by this point we were such a big sort of cool press company that I think Jamie Hewlett and Jamie Hewlett wanted us. Jamie drew Tank Girl for Deadline magazine, and MGM we bought the rights to the movie, so I had to go to MGM and meet everybody in this big, film company, and then I had to go to the premiere in America, in LA, but also I had to see all the screenings as well. And the film wasn't very good to start with. Jamie had to actually draw cartoons in the middle to try and drag it back to the real audience because it wasn't working. Yeah. And so there's all this stuff going on, but I didn't really understand the protocol of film PR. So basically, because when I used to be in a meeting, they used to say, in fact, they do now, what are you going to go for? And I used to just say, everything. And there was no press plan. And obviously that worked because it meant every band I looked after were everywhere. But when it got to Tank Girl, I kind of promised Elle and Sky and Dazed and Confused and ID and all these. I promised them all exclusive covers, and of course every single magazine, Blitz, they all put them on the cover with 8 pages, and then they all rang up and said, "What the fuck are you playing at?" And I said, "Well, I meant exclusive to you," which is a great backup. But so it's all about that, the craziness of looking after a film when I didn't deserve to be doing a film, and then Courtney Love ringing the office in the middle of the night. She was desperate for Savidge and Best to do, and just saying how much she hated us. She left a long rambling message because we didn't do her press. She was doing the soundtrack to Tank Girl, you see.
Yeah.
And the reason it's called the worst movie I've never seen is because I knew the minute I saw that movie, I wasn't going to like it, because I liked the cartoon, I liked Jamie, I liked the vibe of Tank Girl, I loved Tank Girl, she was a hero to me, but I knew the film wouldn't be very good, so I kind of avoided. So I went to all the screenings, and just as the lights went down, I left and walked out the back, and then saw people in the foyer. And so I refused to see the film 20 times. The lights would go down and people were hiding away.
You sneak off.
So it's called The Worst Movie I've Never Seen. And it's all the story of Tank Girl and the premieres all over the world. And that's, so it's stories, just like in the first and second books of, like there's a George Michael story in the new book, which is very vaguely about Suede, but it's mainly about George and his, and Brad Branson, who was Suede's photographer around that time. And George was in love with Brad, and I met George a few times. But it's connected. So, and then there's also a story, which I alluded to at the start of this talk, which was about going to the House of Commons. So there's a chapter called The House of Common People. You'll be pleased to know. So obviously you see what I did there.
Yeah.
And there's again about 12 stories in the third book, and then what I'm going to start saying is I've done with the 90s. There's a whole new century to explore.
Yeah. Well, it's been such a fascinating career, and I guess this is something that having lived and breathed it and followed these bands religiously, to speak to someone who has such a great connection with them has been absolutely fascinating, Jane. I was just thinking, what is the future? I mean, I know obviously you're working, but writing and novels and this sort of thing, would this be something you would just love to pursue as well as everything else?
Yes, I mean, obviously, this one comes out. Hopefully, this new book will be a success, and then if the third one comes out next year, as I say, that's the 90s done. I have got various other. I've got a novel which I'm I've had a story, an idea for a while about people's home, possibly with Britpop people. I don't know.
All hanging out in an old people's home.
Yes, yeah. Which I could just imagine Liam and Noel as feuding elderly brothers. So I would love that. And the walk with the cane would be great, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So, yes, I think writing. I do PR still because, as my dad used to say, it gets the washing up done, and philosophy doesn't. Writing, I'd like to think writing is my career now.
Yeah. Well, Jane, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you about it. This new book, here they come with their makeup on. What's the release date of this one?
April 12th.
Thank you so much for talking to me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really interesting.
Oh, it's been great to chat to you too. Take care.